Hi, and welcome to this Digital Analytics Association webinar, Stop Fixing Your Media Analytics, How to Align Facebook Ads and Google Campaign Manager with your digital analytics platform. Thank you for joining us. My name is Deanna Morrison, and I'll be your moderator for the presentation today. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items. In the GoToWebinar bar on the right-hand side of your screen, you will see a questions area. You are welcome to submit questions at any time during the presentation, and they will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Following the webinar today, the recording will be shared with you in an email. At the conclusion of today's webinar, we ask that you complete a brief survey as it helps CAA to plan future online events. Today, we're joined by our presenter, Ann Saylor, a senior client strategist at Claravine and an experienced digital analytics architect who has implemented Adobe Analytics and Google Analytics for clients across many verticals. At this time, I'll turn the presentation over to Ann.
Thanks so much and welcome. By way of introduction, when you're tracking a campaign, for example, a social campaign, if you're using Adobe Analytics, you might use a parameter such as a CID parameter. And in the case of Google Analytics, you might be appending different UTM parameters such as source, medium, campaign, and optionally term and content parameters. For those of us on the digital analytics side, this is very familiar. And for those on the media side, it may be one part of many things that you do. If we start from here, there are several things that need to be true for this campaign to successfully track in our analytics platform. First of all, for the landing page to be live. If we're sending traffic to a page that is going to a 404 or that isn't completely built out yet, then we're not going to get any data back. Secondly, that we have analytics code in place to collect data about this campaign and that it's firing correctly without any errors. So we want to make sure that the appropriate Adobe Analytics, Google Analytics, or other custom code is in place successfully. And thirdly, that our campaign values are consistently and accurately captured across different teams and channels. Even just these three items in themselves can be challenge enough. And of course, from here, this data is used in other ways. You're likely using it in different forms of reporting, your attribution methodology, whether that's occurring within your analytics platform or outside of it, segmentation efforts, as well as decisions about what content to show if you're doing any sort of personalization efforts based on the history of what people have encountered. So there's a lot of implications, even just for getting this part right. If we come to a question such as, how did this July 4th campaign that we just ran perform? The answers that we get might be different depending on where we're looking. Because of course, we're not just getting data from our analytics platform. A lot of times data is being taken from the native platforms such as Facebook Ads Manager or Google Campaign Manager, where you have additional details about your campaign. In this example, for this July 4th campaign, in Facebook, we've called the campaign July 4th promo, whereas in Campaign Manager, we've called it Independence Day. And in Adobe Analytics, we might be dynamically pulling in a campaign ID that's a long string of numbers. And we don't necessarily have a way to relate all of these together. So when we ask a question such as how this campaign performed, we might get 10 different answers depending on who we ask, with a variety of different ways to name and slice the data, different ways of looking at it. So this can run into real problems because end up with data conflict, mistrust of different teams across the organization because people are not getting the same answers. So somebody might do a search for July 4th in another platform and say, oh, we didn't run the campaign there if they're less familiar with it. Or they might try to roll up the numbers and be missing some of them. So there are real implications for this different nomenclature. Additionally, if we're not communicating about the start and end dates of the campaigns, when going to report on a campaign, it's possible to accidentally take too narrow a slice of data or even too broad a slice of data if this code accidentally got reused later and not get consistent or accurate results. This problem becomes even more pronounced when you think about the number of different platforms and types of technologies involved in the ad world today. So in terms of marketing execution platforms, As most on this call are very familiar, there's a number of different technologies, all of the different ad networks. You might be using a DSP, you might be using a video platform, number of different paid social or other paid media platforms. And you really want to be able to analyze consistently all of this data and make decisions off of it and understand how things are performing. And the larger and more complex this universe gets, the more difficult that can seem to be. A lot of times people try to solve this by undertaking large projects to do data cleaning or ETL work to clean all of this up in a database and relate it after the fact. And if you've worked with this data, you're familiar with how difficult that can sometimes be, just based on the fact that there are dissimilarities in this data from the beginning. And those can be things as far as minor nomenclature differences or something completely lacking in another platform. So then when you go back to marry the analytics data and the native paid media data, it doesn't always necessarily align. You're not always able to get to the end state that you want. On top of that, there's a number of additional common roadblocks that people encounter, a lot of times just based on organizational structure and how the teams are connected or not connected. Many times the analytics team is not completely aligned with the teams that are hands-on running the campaigns, and they don't necessarily communicate about reporting stakeholders or their reporting cycle. And as a result, sometimes you might get the different numbers from different people situation. You might get people pulling things from platforms that do or don't make sense, and the teams aren't always in communication. Further, if you have campaigns that are managed by an outside agency for your company, or you are that outside agency, you may not necessarily have full details on the company's internal campaign naming policies, or even that the campaign that you're running or that your agency is running relates to a larger effort that should be named the same. So there can be some communication challenges there as well. And that all translates to that misalignment on how campaigns are named and referred to across different platforms. And then what happens is this challenge becomes larger and larger and begins to require such significant effort that it seems insurmountable and therefore sometimes doesn't happen. Even if the data comes in relatively cleanly, a lot of times creating these details in your analytics platform might seem overwhelming if you're appending a lot of additional data. And so if you have any type of manual upload process, you might give lip service to the fact that that's supposed to occur weekly or daily or monthly. But if there's any manual element involved, it may not happen. And if it's automated, unless the data is standardized from the start, your results may vary. So to summarize, the volume and variety of different social media display campaigns, as well as other campaign types that you're running, might make them hard to standardize and track. And it's difficult to get the granularity and level of detail that you want. So a lot of times these things are tracked in a generic way, just using referring domain without really getting the specificity that you need. And as a result, in your analytics platform, it's often hard to get detailed post-click web behavior to tie to specific creatives, ads, and campaigns. And that translates into difficulty being able to perform detailed analysis on which campaigns are truly succeeding or failing. We found that about only 40 to 60% of total media spend is really effectively tracked by a lot of companies. There are some campaigns that either make it into some sort of generic bucket or just don't make it in at all because of this misalignment. So what can you do from here to start to fix this problem? There's a couple of steps that we can recommend at a high level, and we'll get more specific as we go along. Of course, the first step is to standardize your general data taxonomy so that you have a structure to fit into, allowing you to deploy a customized, consistent classification framework in the case of Adobe Analytics, or data structures in the case of Google Analytics or your other databases for your campaign and experience tracking. You want to be able to easily manage and enrich your data by pushing and pulling data from different platforms and making sure that that data is aligned before the campaigns go live. Automating this serves a big purpose so that you can scale and get this across your entire enterprise. and then use that data to optimize your performance and get richer insights out of your campaigns. Now, practically, what does this look like? First, you want to inventory which teams and technologies are being used. And even in this process of discovery, it's common to find teams or campaigns that you weren't necessarily aware of before. Just because once an enterprise gets large enough, sometimes that communication can get lost. Begin to bring these channels into your company's standard nomenclature. I've done a past webinar. This one that I did, that I'm referring to, was Adobe focused. It was called Keys to a Best-in-Class Adobe Analytics Classification Process. And I go into a lot more detail there on what you might consider when developing a strategy here. And from there, automate your tracking code creation and metadata syncing where possible. And what I mean by that is calling the same thing across the board, which is easier said than done. So we'll go through an example of what this process might look like without a platform in place to do this and which piece of it might change. A lot of times you might have a budget approval step or an insertion order that kicks off this whole process of running a campaign. And your process may look slightly different than this, but just by way of example, it might start there. Then the campaign might start getting created in the platform where it will ultimately get executed. The creative gets developed, tracking codes get appended to that, and the campaign entry may be manual or there may be some sort of bulk upload involved, but generally there's a person involved at that step. And somebody may or may not be manually checking that the site is live and that all of the necessary details are in place. If that's happening, a lot of times it relies on an individual, and if it's short turnaround, there may be delays or it may not happen. Then the campaign goes live, and to make the steps on the left translate into success on the right really requires alignment from the beginning. And if that doesn't happen, then the data may flow inconsistently depending on how accurate or inaccurate or whether parts of this process happened. The step that we're really talking about here are these two pieces in the center. To have a platform that can ingest, validate, and standardize the details about the campaign, and some sort of automated way of confirming that the tags and pages are ready and everything is universally aligned across the platforms. So we'll talk a little bit about how this looks in detail in a couple of different ways. Let's say that we're running a Facebook campaign. We can start by creating the campaign in Facebook as we normally would. And the budget approval process and all of the steps before there, of course, proceeding according to your company's specifications. And with the Claravine platform in the center, we're able to absorb the data that's already been entered in Facebook and ensure that it matches the types of structures and nomenclature and validation that you're expecting, and be able to apply a successfully created and well-formatted tracking code to the URL. Of course, that being either the custom parameter name that you're using for Adobe Analytics and or the UTM parameters for Google Analytics with consistency across campaigns. And we can even automatically generate those from the details that Facebook already has if there's enough information there. Then once the data makes it through from Claravine to the analytics platform, in advance of the campaign going live, we're able to recognize that the same campaign that was campaign ID 123456 in Facebook that's called July 4th in Facebook is also called July 4th in your analytics, in your tagging. We know when it goes live. We know the creative details. We have all the information about this campaign without a lot of additional effort. And the same thing is called the same thing pre-click and post-click, making it a lot easier to marry the data between platforms after the fact and align that data. In the case of Google Campaign Manager, you might have a similar process where the campaign is created as usual in Campaign Manager, and then we're able to take in all of the data that Campaign Manager has, automatically generate or append additional metadata if there's manual entry that needs to happen, and then send that detail through to analytics. In this case, I showed the example of Adobe Analytics, since in the case of an entirely Google stack, you might be doing this through other means. So you can absorb the data, bring it in, make sure that it meets all of your standards before things happen, making it a lot easier to marry it up after the fact. So this really starts with the standardization process from the beginning and then moves through the entire process that we just described. Something else that's possible with Google Campaign Manager is actually to start in the Claravine platform and then send the data through from there to Campaign Manager. So before the campaign even gets provisioned, everything is completely in alignment rather than importing it and correcting anything that doesn't match spec. So once you go through this, how do these steps actually translate to improve productivity and richer analytics? The step that we mentioned before about asking the question on how the July 4th campaign performed. In this case, we see that it's called the same thing across all different platforms. If we're saying how did the July 4th promotion perform directly in Facebook, we can get to the same campaign that we're referring to for post-click data in our analytics platform, and the same with our campaign manager platform. And these campaigns might have different end dates across the platforms. So if we're able to import the campaign end date into our analytics solution, then we can better understand when we expect to see data for it and when it's active. And so by importing that data, we're able to have that information without having to switch back and forth between the platforms or marry up the data later. And even down to the ad level or the creative level, we're able to get aligned at the more granular detail that we might need without a lot of additional effort. So, of course, this is to translate into better results and allowing the analytics team to focus on performing more impactful analyses rather than spending all of their time cleaning data and trying to understand which campaigns are the same thing. Then the channel roll-up data and the relative attribution across different platforms can become accurate and complete. When you perform these channel roll-ups, you'll want to make sure that everything under a particular channel is complete, nothing's being left out because of incorrect naming. And your teams, of course, want to get credit for the campaigns that they've performed that have produced results once people get to your site. And so by undertaking the steps for an accurate channel roll-up by syncing this data, you're able to feed better data into your attribution models, and better data will, of course, produce more complete results that you can make quality decisions off of. And all of the decisions that you can make from here generally could translate into improved ROI for these campaigns because you're starting from a better place. And in terms of applying this across channels beyond the ones that we just described, there's also a previous webinar on how to improve marketing ROI through better campaign tracking, where we go into detail on some of the additional platforms. When companies undertake these types of processes, they're able to generally see a return on ad spend improvement. They're able to get complete tracking code format compliance because a lot of the stops where human error is possible have been completely removed. And analytics teams are able to see up to a 95% reduction in time spent managing data. And of course, not just analytics teams that are dealing with the reporting, but also the people that are manually entering the campaigns are not having to pop back and forth constantly between platforms and worry about whether things are aligned or if they have all of the right information. So undertaking these processes can lead your company to a more complete and accurate understanding of your campaign performance. And as we were talking about, this allows you to make better decisions on where to spend your marketing dollars, which means improved campaign efficiency with less time spent cleaning data after the fact. And really taking the time to align these processes up front allows dividends to come for future years as you continue to maintain and update this process as your company grows. So that was a general overview of some steps that you can take to improve the validity of your data across different platforms and get some better results. Now we'll turn it over to the audience for some questions.
Thank you, Anne. So we have a question already. They're starting to come in. The first one is, how can you measure reach on Facebook once they don't share device ID with Campaign Manager?
So that is a very specific platform question, and I would definitely refer you to the teams that are running those campaigns. My personal specialty is on the analytics side of things. So that is a little bit beyond the scope of the webinar, but thank you so much for the question.
Okay, we have another one. What are the most common inconsistencies that you see among the different platforms?
So there's a lot of different things, of course, that can happen as you increase the number of platforms. The different data points expand, and sometimes you might see slight variations in campaign names. There might be extra characters some places, like if you're copying and pasting from Excel, extra hidden characters can get in there, line feed characters, things like that. So I would call those just different enough names. And in other cases, completely just not tracking the campaign or introducing something that it really throws a wrench into the entire process at some point, either with the site itself or with any part of those validation criteria that we were mentioning earlier. So those are some things that we see very commonly.
Thank you. We've got a bunch of questions coming in. Where do you localize Sprinklr if it is your approved corporate platform?
So we do have many clients that use Sprinklr for their media, and that is kind of part of the larger universe that we're talking about. But that is a question that I would invite you to cover in more detail based on your specific company.
Okay, thank you. Do I need to already be using Adobe Analytics to use this service?
No, we have a number of clients that use Adobe Analytics, Google Analytics, use only custom databases and have tracking that is not from a standardized platform even. So anytime that you're feeding data into some downstream location where it needs to get married up later, then this can be useful. It doesn't presuppose a specific analytics platform or any platform at all, although that is some of our use case.
Great, thank you. How can you track Facebook view-through conversions on Campaign Manager?
So that is a platform-specific question and a great question. Also, a little bit outside of the scope. I know we've talked about a whole bunch of different platforms, and definitely those are ones that we mentioned. And just to kind of confirm what the focus of our work is syncing the data between those platforms, and then what makes it downstream into your analytics or your database. There's definitely a lot of connection that can happen, and viewthrough obviously a big use case, but those are between two platforms other than the kind of the flow that we're discussing. But thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Can't you achieve similar campaign tracking via custom tracking codes and marketing channel reports in Adobe Analytics?
So absolutely, and that's exactly the type of thing that we're talking about, is how the data that gets produced that goes into those reports. So we're not a replacement for your analytics platform. We're not an attribution platform. We are a data quality and governance platform that makes sure that you're feeding your analytics platform clean data. So the way that things make it into the marketing channel reports into Adobe Analytics presupposes that the tracking codes or the element that you're using meets the marketing channel processing rules that tell Adobe where to bucket the campaign. And unless the campaign codes coming in have the appropriate prefix to be bucketed correctly, or the other configuration that you're looking for, then things won't fall into the right bucket. And that's where we can help, is making sure that those details about the campaigns are completely accurate. So not only your top level channels, but any breakdowns that you perform can be consistent and accurate.
Okay. How does Claravine append tracking URLs to social ads after the fact? Wouldn't the UTM values have to be added to the URL when the social ad is created?
So we connect to the various platforms that we've described via API. So that does allow us to, when specifically configured, make modifications where needed. So yes, the traditional way would be for people to go back and forth, produce these codes somewhere, and then manually paste them into the link field in the execution platform. But with the way that some of these work, we're able to, with appropriate configuration and permissions, push those adjustments.
Thank you. Can you speak a little about the Claravine platform? Can you use it with Google Tag Manager and Google Analytics?
So absolutely, you can use our platform with the Google stack. Tag Manager is going to be on the side of, the way that the data flows and is structured and is assigned within Google Analytics. So we would not necessarily relate directly to what you're doing in Tag Manager. As far as GA, we're able to validate that any pages that you're sending traffic to have appropriate GA tracking for your particular property ID, that the structure of those UTM parameters is accurate, complete, rolls up to your channel groupings the way that you'd expect, and that if there are campaigns that are running outside of the natively integrated Google stack, such as on various social platforms, that we're able to apply the right nomenclature and tracking to those as well in a way that aligns with everything else that you're doing. So those are a few of the ways that we would work with it.
Great. Do you recommend any naming convention using UTMs to distinguish between campaign and platform?
So absolutely, there is, kind of the standard way of how the UTM parameters are used. And for those clients on Adobe, I had the previous webinar that I did that referenced the classifications for the GA stack. You're typically going to want your medium to represent the specific effort, such as, CPC or display or, any of those signifiers, and then your source to represent the kind of sub-level of that, the specific platform that you're running, your campaign to be a specific and aligned name, and then your term and content to be used appropriately for further levels of distinction. And people have a lot of different ways that they do that. I could go on for a long time about that. But yes, there are definitely kind of some basic standards that people generally tend to follow from the way that those roll up into reporting and the way that they're used, and then some further standards that make sense based on what your individual company is doing, which is a lot of either the day-to-day conversation that we have with our clients. So there's really a lot to say there, but I think I'll pause the response there.
Thank you. Does Claravine provide any of its own reporting about campaign tracking quality?
So Claravine does have a reports area, and you're able to see all of the codes that are produced historically in our platform and all of the details of those codes. And if you do make modifications, so basically you're prevented from doing things that are non-compliant in the first place, but if you do change your criteria later and you want to go back and see which campaigns do not meet the updated rules, then you're able to actually go back and see that for historical submissions. And then otherwise, we do have reporting about the kind of activity and usage and other details that are coming in. So you are able to see a complete history.
Okay. Can you manage your Facebook campaigns using your platform, or do we still need to create campaigns through Business Manager?
Yeah, so in the case of Facebook, you would be starting with the Facebook platform and then using Claravine to get the data downstream to different places and sync the nomenclature. We would not necessarily be creating it. And of course, for ongoing management, if you wanted to change things like your budgets and bids and ad types and those things, those would all definitely take place in the native platform. But we would fit in at the steps described.
Thank you. How do you handle discrepancies of conversions between web analytics versus each marketing vendor, i.e. vendors with different look-back periods for conversions that want to take credit for ROI.
Yep. That's of course always a challenge, because a lot of times you'll get conversion rates that are like 400%, and how is that possible if you add up everybody who thinks they got credit for your conversion? So having the standard nomenclature really allows you to have the data to I don't want to say fight that, but get to the most accurate data. So if you have the accurate post-click attribution coming in through your analytics platform, then you're likely collecting enough data to have kind of the raw output of that to see everybody that encountered this campaign, exactly what they did on the site, and the order that they encountered the different channels in and what happened. So with something like Adobe Analytics with Attribution IQ, which has come out within the past few years, you're able to change your model and see what happened depending on, of course, your first touch and last touch, but also algorithmic and other more advanced attribution models, and see how that actually looks, and also get at the raw data. Similarly with GA, you're able to get into the different types of attribution and models and situations. And if you can say, hey, depending on how I look at, let's just say again, the July 4th campaign, this is how it changes depending on these different channels. This is how these different channels do or don't overlap. Adobe actually has a great overlap visualization, and a lot of questions to kind of start to parse that out rather than taking each platform at its word, because of course then you'll wind up with that 400% credit situation.
Thank you. Have you seen the analytics solution where the main website analytics is Adobe Analytics, but the marketing team uses GA free version to manage the campaigns? What are the gaps you see with this solution? GA free version is implemented in a page view only, very basic.
Yeah, so definitely a lot of potential for misalignment, just because Adobe and GA have slightly different ways of looking at attribution. By default, GA is going to be a last non-direct click, whereas Adobe is not going to be a last non-direct model by default. So you're likely to encounter some differences there. With the Adobe side of things, you've got the kind of waterfall or C version of the channels, where if it starts going through the rules and it notices that something is paid search, then the future rules won't override it necessarily. So if something gets assigned earlier, it doesn't get assigned later. So that can account for some differences. And then, of course, the degree to which the various channels are integrated or not integrated into the native platform. And then, of course, if UTMs aren't being used, if those campaigns are even visible there. So we definitely do see a lot of situations where people have either rogue implementations or multiple implementations, and those aren't necessarily aligned. So ideally, you do have a single analytics solution across your entire website so that you have a source of truth. A lot of companies do have simultaneous implementations running, but there's so many differences that it's important to understand them. And because that's the reality a lot of places, the best we can do is make sure that everything is called the same thing, so that once you've accounted for all of the differences, that you can at least know that you're talking about the same campaign.
Great. How much implementation has to occur to integrate Claravine data into Adobe Analytics?
So it's more of a configuration. So we are normally a very fast implementation because we're not a pixel that lives on your site. We don't really deal with a lot of personal information. It's pretty straightforward. We connect via the API. So once we're connected to an API-enabled account with Adobe Analytics, we're able to set up the rest from our side. So our setup process, everything in our platform, the configuration of the way that the different channels work and the way that the classifications are connected is generally 4 to 6 weeks at maximum, and that's including admin and user training and a lot of other steps other than the work itself. and we do have a lot of support throughout that process.
Thank you. This comes from a person who missed the first 5 minutes of the webinar, and they asked, would it be possible to briefly mention the role of Claravine in the data process between Campaign Manager and Analytics? How can we access the previous webinar? Oh, I'll send a link to that. They're asking about the previous webinar to increase ROI, and that is on DAA's website, so they can find that there. But their question to you is, would you be able to briefly mention the role of Claravine in the data process between Campaign Manager and Analytics?
Sure, I can definitely recap that real quick. So in Campaign Manager, the first way would be to create the campaign as normal in Campaign Manager. Then at the step of Claravine, we'd be able to get updates and have all of the details about campaigns that have been created since our last sync. We'd be able to then map that data to various locations in your analytics platform, whether that's classifications in Adobe Analytics, or if it's another platform, the way that you want those fields output, and then send that data through. And also, if there's tracking codes that need to be applied that are not, then that's something that we could potentially work with. So those are a couple of ways that we could fit in that process in that model. The second is that sometimes people use us as kind of a, I'm going to use the term bulk upload, but not in the sense that we typically use it internally. So you can actually start in the Claravine platform, fill out all of the columns that you would need to initiate a campaign within a campaign manager, and actually send it through and provision it starting from our platform, because we're connected to the Campaign Manager API. And that would ensure that from the very start, you have all of the information that you need, and it's all aligned and named correctly and formatted correctly.
Great. Do you have the same analytics support for Google Analytics like for Adobe Analytics?
So yes, for both platforms, we're able to detect the presence of the analytics solution on the page. We're able to make sure that the page is live, make sure that the data is flowing to the right report suite in the case of Adobe Analytics, or the right property ID in the case of Google Analytics, and that everything's in place for proper tracking and firing. And then really it's just other than the different terminology. We absolutely support both. We have clients that work with both, and when we send data through, as I was mentioning, we can send it through to classification fields for details about the campaign in Adobe, or if you have a custom dimension with custom data import fields in GA off of it, we can work with that. Or even if those custom data import fields are built off of one of the existing parameters, there's support there. So absolutely, we support both.
Great. You may have already answered this one. Does your platform generate UTMs, or are UTMs fed into your platform?
So we're able to, so it depends on the exact workflow, but yes, we're able to generate UTMs simultaneous with any, other types of parameters that you need, and including any even, non-analytics parameters, placeholders, anything else. So we can generate UTMs from our side. Now, in the case of us importing data from other platforms, if it is already present in one of the fields, then we would be able to bring in what is already there. We'll get the values from the other platforms, and you'd be able to see that that particular link already had UTMs applied. But a lot of times in the workflow, what we're used to do is to generate consistent and accurate tracking parameters, and then apply those parameters to a given campaign.
Great. Does the platform allow for ROAS calculation? If yes, where does the cost media data stored?
So this is another situation where we feed the right data to enable those calculations in other platforms. So we are working with the details and metadata about the campaign, so the naming convention, the specific details about how it's run, where it's run, and what it's called at every level. But for ROAS calculations, you'd be speaking from a metrics perspective. So again, we're not trying to replace your attribution platforms or any sort of, cost calculation platforms. But when you do go to marry up data from different places to get to your full return on ad spend, then you'd want accurate data to do so, and you'd want the campaign to be called the same thing everywhere that it's referred to, and that's where we fit in.
Great. My organization is currently advertising on various social platforms. We use Google Tag Manager for all of our tracking, and we use a data visualization tool to report everything. Could you briefly describe where Claravine could benefit us?
Yep. So by the time that things make it into a data visualization tool, a lot of times that data has been collected from multiple platforms and is being fed into a database somewhere and then eventually gets surfaced in the visualization tool. And so a lot of times it's kind of taken for granted that the data in that visualization tool is, complete and consistent, whereas that may or may not be the case. And so we're kind of starting from the very first step before that data is even collected to assure that what gets into that visualization platform eventually can be aggregated properly. So for example, I'm just going to take a very simple example like a campaign name. So if you call the campaign name ABC in social platform 1 and DEF in social platform 2, and then some other variation in social platform 3, because those are run by 3 different teams or agencies, and then it makes it all the way through the process and it gets into your visualization tool, and you're looking at some sort of campaigns reporting, then you've got 3 line items that really could be one. And not everybody necessarily knows that those are related or that those should be considered the same thing. So by taking the steps to clean things up earlier, and of course this applies to every level, not just to campaign name, then the data that you get would be more accurate and complete by the end step. And then further, if you're using that platform to marry data together from different data sets, like you're downloading cost data from the native platforms, and you're trying to marry that up with post-click data from an analytics platform or another platform, or really any other type of data that you're trying to connect it to do that, you have to have a consistent identifier. And without kind of pre-planning to make sure that that is available, a lot of times not all of the data will match up. So that's a little bit on that. And so I'll there's more that I could say, but I think that's enough for an intro.
Thanks, Ann. How does this fit in with auto tagging in Google Analytics?
So we do have a lot of clients that use us alongside auto tagging, since auto tagging has channels that it can't reach. There are lots of different types of auto tagging for Google products, but of course you're probably not only running ads in the Google universe. So of course you don't want to combine appended UTM tagging with your auto tagging, because you can have splits in your data that way, but you do want consistency between both types of tracking. So, and I'm going to use the term bulk upload, but in a different way than I did before. So you might be able to create a sheet for import into a platform like Google Ads that can validate that everything's named correctly and in compliance, and then kick off those campaigns. And even though they're auto tagged, the data that you get back later about those campaigns can be consistent with other parameters that are manually tagged on platforms that don't have auto tagging, just from a nomenclature perspective. So that's a little bit on that.
Thank you. You may have already touched a little bit on this one. How is the connection made between what the media platforms know about the campaign and what makes it into the analytics platform?
So basically that all boils down to a common key, which in the case of Adobe is maybe the tracking code parameter or another variable that you're collecting. And I'll do an Adobe example and then I'll do a GA example. So in an Adobe example, your analytics platform is configured generally via a tag manager to recognize that whenever it sees a parameter, for example, named CID or whatever you decide to name it, off of a valid URL that has your company's tracking on it, then it says, okay, whenever I see the CID parameter, put the value of that parameter into the tracking code report. So if I have CID equals ABC123 as a valid parameter off my URL, then ABC123 makes it into the tracking code report because it's been set up that way. And then we can associate code ABC123 with the fact that it has a start date of, let's say, July 15th, that it's called summer sale, that it has creative ID 23456, and all of this data that maybe used to only be known to the native advertising platform. And from Adobe side, the location where we push this additional data is called a classification. From a GA perspective, in kind of a similar way, we can relate the value of a given parameter to custom data import fields that have been set up. For example, relating the fact that a social campaign that was called Summer 20% Off has particular attributes about it, that it's active or inactive, its start date, and all of those things that might not be captured in the native UTM parameters, we could send through directly to custom data import fields.
Thank you so much, Anne. That is all we have time for today, or not all we have time for, but that's all the questions we have today. So on behalf of DAA, I would like to thank you all for your participation in today's event. And thank you again, Anne, for sharing your knowledge with us.